Thank you, Steve. I'm going to talk a little bit this morning, and I'll keep my comments fairly short, and I think this will be better driven by what questions you want to ask me. But I'm going to talk a little bit about, and I had this really cute phrase I was going to use this morning, so I'll throw it out there, but it's not really right anymore. You know, it's data-centric consolidation leading to data center closure. But what it really is data-centric evaluation that leads to data center closure. And I want to talk a little bit about what that means. So within the Department of Navy, I want to set the stage of what we're trying to do. So we're on a process here to take $1.3 billion out of the IT budget that's related to data center spend. To help us do that, we've taken the money. It's a little bit like burning your ship. It's an effective management tool sometimes. We've decided to use it for this. One of the things I think that Steve led to that we have to focus on is you really do want to count the money. I mean, it's nice to count data centers. It's nice to count servers. But in the end, it is about counting fewer dollars. And how do we get there? And I think the way you have to get there is really understand the data. I am a data-driven guy. I like math. I like numbers. And I like data. The things that we're trying to look at as we do our data center closure, and I don't like the word consolidation. Consolidation leaves things in place. It does not get you the full amount of money. You got to close. You have got to close facilities. That's part of the cost. When I say savings, I want you to understand how we define savings too, because sometimes that's a complicated definition. I don't like complicated definitions. Savings to me means I spent less money. It's a very simple definition. It doesn't count cost avoidance. It doesn't count. It means I spent less money. So we're going to try to spend $1.3 billion less. To make that happen, we've taken the $1.3 billion. To get there, you've got to understand the data that's in your data center. You really do. You have to understand the risk around that data, and it's not just the security risk. Very important to understand the security risk, but you've got to understand other risks around that data. How is the data packaged today? Is it in an application that lends itself to virtualization, that lends itself to maybe being modernized in a way that we can then eliminate the geographic considerations of where that data needs to be housed? I think there are a lot of people who believe, well, today all the technology out there doesn't matter where you house your data. You can put it in the middle of Iowa and it will be just fine. That's not true. You do have to factor where is your data. If it's an older application, in fact, sometimes you're not going to be able to move it that far away from the user base. Doesn't mean you can't save money on it, but you got to know those things. You've got to know what your data is used for. You got to know how many times you're using the same data element in how many databases, because one of the things that helps get the number of data centers down is getting rid of some of the data. That seems pretty obvious, but it's hard to do. You've got to go in and you've got to then understand at the data element level, what do you have in these data centers? How many times are you repeating the same data element? How many times are you saving it? How many applications do you need that data element in? You start pulling down the data, and that leads you to start questioning how many applications you need. So I think Steve is very right. You've got to combine. You'll hear people call data center rationalization, data center or application rationalization. I don't like that term either. I like application kill. You got to get rid of them. This is about getting rid of some of the applications. It's not about rationalization. You're going to do some of that, but you want to save money, you got to get rid of applications. When you get rid of application, what are you getting rid of? Data. But that's what part of this is about. You have to understand your security risk. That means the risk of exposure of that data, what happens if you use it. You really do have to understand that. And in our business inside the Department of Navy, we really have to understand that, and you want us to understand that. You've got to be able to look at the cost drivers for your data centers. Now, I think everybody knows the biggest cost driver for data center is labor. It is still the biggest thing that costs. There are other factors into data centers that also relate to the data. The biggest factor around data is labor. How many people do you have managing the applications and the data? The structures of some of these applications that are older take more people to manage them. That's just a fact. You got to understand power. Power is a big player in data. So some of the things that we've tried to do in the Don. I have a dashboard that lists all of, and I say all of my data centers. I get a lot of questions, well, how many data centers do you have? Well, which definition do you want to use? What I would tell you is we have about 150 data centers that I'm going to operate on because they have enough. They're big enough that they spend enough money that I'm interested. I mean, part of what you have to do here is do a little bit of macro math. Where is your big money? And it's pretty much where are your big locations. Work on those first. That's what we're trying to do. Then you can go back and clean up, those places where you've got 12 servers, and it meets the definition of a data center. Okay, it meets the definition. But if it doesn't have a big dollar sign with it initially, I'm not too concerned. I'm not too worried about that. I really want to go after where I've got 50 servers or more. You also have to understand the facility that you're in. Department of Navy, fact, we own a lot of old buildings. One of the things that we have to take a look at is, and this gets into where cost avoidance does become somewhat important in this. If I have a data center today located in a building that A is currently costing me a lot of money to maintain, and when I look out and I work with facilities people and I see that, hey, this building, because of where it's at, to upgrade its coolant system, which is still a factor in data centers, to upgrade the building and keep it in standards, I have an out-year bill that's in the millions of dollars. That ought to play in my thinking that says maybe that's not where I want to stay. So you have to understand that. You've got to go through all your data, and one of the things we had done before we had FedRAMP, we had the MAC levels. So we had gone through all our data and said, okay, what MAC level is that data at? That's a good starting point. Now we're doing that in the FedRAMP levels, what it is. What I can tell you, to get where I want to go, I've got to get over 50% of my data in some type of commercial solution. That's where we're headed. Now, what do I mean by some type of commercial solution? Think of an option. That can be anywhere where I am totally just going to a provided solution that's public. Some of you may know, Department of Navy, we are in the process of putting much of our public-facing data in an Amazon cloud solution. And people say, well, why are you doing an Amazon cloud solution? Because it saves me 66% of what I was spending. Why else am I doing that? Well, it's public-facing, so who's the audience? The public. Why isn't that in a place where the public can really get to it? I mean, there is some obvious things to do here, and we're trying to get to that. I could also have a solution that says it's a shared government environment. In the commercial world, but it's shared government. It's not an open cloud where everybody goes to that. And then I can run to the extreme that says I have my own private solution. You'll notice I'm not using the word cloud. Part of those solutions can be cloud. Frankly, there is still a place for the standard data center non-cloud solution. There's still some of that makes sense to do. Getting that blend right and getting it into as much of the commercial environment I can is what I really have to do to, A, meet the mission, continue the security, and drive down the cost. So when I say I'm focused on cost, people say, well, that means you're not focused on mission. No, I think just like any business, if I don't make my product or make my mission, that's a pretty stupid thing to do. So a given is I got to meet mission, I got to meet product, I got to meet business requirements. How do I do that at the lowest cost? And one of the overlay factors for us that's maybe heavier than other people's is security. But it's still an overlay factor, and I have to understand the risk equation. That's a harder risk equation to get to. I'm not going to lie to you. How do you manage that risk equation that says this dollar of security buys me this much, the next dollar buys me how much more, and is it worth that risk? And, of course, in our business, there are other factors besides the dollar inside of the security. What is the security risk? What's the risk of the data getting out from an exposure standpoint? What's the risk of the climate? And we're seeing that it get to be an industry. I mean, the Target incident, bad thing, but it's driving some good behavior. Now I see when people come in and talk to me in the industry, much more interest in all of those factors around security. Some of it, bottom line, but some of it is what happens to your reputation if that data gets out there. Target saw a significant drop initially in the number of shoppers. That affects bottom line, but there's a reputation piece there too. We have to look at all of that. as we're looking at the data, and that helps you decide where you're going to put your data. We are fortunate inside the Don in that we've had experience with, I would call you, the commercial set of solutions. NMCI. You can hate NMCI. You can love NMCI. Here's the facts about what I will tell you about NMCI. NMCI levelized the IT playing field at cost inside the Department of the Navy. It did that. We paid overall less money. We got a better level of service for everybody. NGEN's taken us to the next level, and it is part of our data center answer. We already have big pieces of our data in a commercial data center. It is run today by HP, who won the NGEN contract, was won by NMCI. That's a commercial set of solutions. We can leverage some of that, and we're going to do that. We're going to go beyond that, and work on how do we get into some other large commercial players in that. How do we partner with other agencies? We are not, I think there's a big belief out here that we're not going to do anything with DISA. Just to set the record straight, we have a lot of stuff with DISA. We're going to continue to DISA. Great applause for DISA. If you haven't seen it, they've come out with the DISA Cloud Data Center solution. It is price competitive, very much so. When you look at the security they put in that and the pricing you can get, that's a very competitive solution for us. We're going to look at that. I think all of those factors are helping drive down both the government and the commercial cost. Steve and I were talking a little bit before this. I believe we got about a 5 to 6 year window right now where, because of what's happened in the commercial world, we have a glut of capacity. There's a lot of capacity in the commercial world that we have to, in the government, figure out how do we use that and take advantage of that lower cost because of the capacity glut. How long it will last, I think 5, 6 years easy. How do we capitalize on that? How do we get out there faster is the questions we're constantly asking ourselves. How do we take and make sure all of those factors get presented the same way? We talked about facilities, the power, the labor. How do you get the blended solution set that says this is the right optimization for this closure or for this set of data is what we struggle with, just like I think every industry that's of size is struggling today. The other thing I would tell you, a lot of this has to do more with the social changes than the technical. There are not a lot of technical issues that are not solvable here. Most of them have already been solved. But you have some social issues around data. People are used to having their data with them. They want that data right under their desk if they could have it. They'd have server farms right there. So you will have to get through some of that. Some of that's reasonable to think about. And in the past, we certainly have done some things where we made data and we said, okay, we can move it over here, and that did not deliver a good performance to the user. We've got to recognize that. So you also have the factor of being able to go in and show the user that your data plan, how you're going to structure their data, where you're going to put it, is going to deliver the service levels that they require. Now, that said, because I want to completely confuse you, we also have to get some standardization in the level of service required. So I will say this. As we went through our data, we found that most of our data is really level, in the old Mac levels 2 and 3, in the new levels it's a 3 to 5 level of data. That requires a certain level of storage and a certain level of access and a certain level of backup. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between COOP and data restoral. COOP, in our definition, is I've got kind of a hot backup that, if it goes down within 60 seconds, I can switch it over to another data center and I can have it up and running. That's really expensive. Guess what? Most data doesn't need that level of backup. But everybody wants that level of backup because it's really good to have. If you're the customer and you're the user of that data, hey, that's great to have the fact that if anything happens, I just switch over and I don't even see it. But there's a cost to that. So one of the things we are having to do is say inside the Don, sorry, this is what your data, this is what you get with your data. When we look at your requirement, we look at how you're using this data, we look at the mission value, you don't need a full COOP. You need some level of data restoration, and it will vary. Some cases it's 72 hours. Some cases I can live with the data getting back up in 5 or 6 days, and it's perfectly fine. That's okay. That lowers the cost. That lets me do things like if that's the case and I just need data restoration, and I'm not picking on Iowa this morning. It's just I saw a news story in Iowa this morning. But there's some great data centers in Iowa that really are cheap to operate. Now, one of the reasons they're cheap to operate is because they're not near anything. So it makes it a little hard. But for data restoration, if I'm just parking data and I just need to recover it in 5 days, I want to take advantage of those locations. How do I get it in there and say that's okay? We've got to do that. We have to think about not just what I'll call the primary data, where you're putting it to use every day, but how do you do your backup and how do you consolidate that in the lowest cost environment that you can, that, again, meets mission and security requirements, but actually meets requirements. I mean, I worked for a gentleman once that said, the minimum wouldn't be the minimum if it wasn't good enough. That's a fact. You in industry may be a little better at that because of the bottom line driving. You'll invest what you need to invest to meet your customer requirements. You'll have a certain level of satisfaction that you will agree to, and that's what you live to and that's what you invest to. We are very much in the data center business inside the Department of Navy doing the same thing. What is the requirement? What can the customer live with? What makes my investment balanced? And that's a hard thing to wrestle with, particularly inside an environment that's not used to operating that way. But that's where we're headed. That's what we're trying to get to. In addition to knowing all about our data structure and the applications, one of the things that we've made a decision on is in some cases it's okay to virtualize the data and park it somewhere else. I haven't made any change to that app. I've just virtualized it so it can move easier, wrapped it in a container. Now, some people say, well, that doesn't do anything to improve security. Every case we can, I want to try to improve security, but I'm back at cost. But I will argue this too. If I make something less expensive to operate, and I haven't increased the security risk, and I'm already living with that security risk, is that okay? Yeah, the answer is yes. If that's still within a standard and still within a risk I'm willing to accept, and I have lessened the operational cost, that's okay. That's another argument that sometimes is hard to have with people that, well, wait a minute, but you still have this. Yeah, I still have the same risk. I can't fix that risk right now, but I can operate it at 25 to 30% less. That's a good thing. That actually frees up some money that maybe will let me fix the risk sooner. So these are a little bit different ways of thinking it, and you've got to package all of that in the right way to everybody in leadership understands it. Just like in business, you've got your corporate board. Well, we have a corporate board too, and it includes people inside the Department of Navy, inside the Department of Defense, and Congress. It's an interesting corporate board. How do you explain to them? They're asking some very good questions about data centers today and data in general. How do we answer that and make sure they understand what we're doing? I think I will shut up now and take your questions. This looks like an easy group. There are no questions.
Oh, there's got to be some questions. Come on, we've got some folks with...
That's the advantage of going really early in the morning. None of us have had enough coffee yet. It's not 9 o'clock. Your brains aren't firing. Sir. So I think you have a couple things you've got to go challenge in your assumptions. So I have a lot of customers tell me they need this application. And then we'll go and say, well, yeah, but do you need 6 of them? Because you basically now have 6 applications, and in some cases it's higher, that seem to have 80% of the same data elements and do 80% of the same stuff. So what I think you offer the customer, now I'm going to cheat. I'm going to change who the definition of the customer is. What you offer the corporate customer is, hey, do you really want to keep spending all of the money to run all of these applications? Or could you say this application meets 80%, let's do a little modification, maybe we get to 90%, you know what, we'll live without the last 10. That is the discussion you have to have, particularly in today's fiscal environment. I mean, you know that. You're in the same fiscal environment I am. It's not a lot of fun right now. How do you drive those costs down? So while you have to take the customer as a factor, in the end, if you can meet the mission, minimum requirements of that mission, because that's what we have to meet, and you can do that with less applications, that's what you want to do. Now, the other trick that I will tell you have to look at, you got to know what the application cost. Good work. We've closed some applications. And then I'll ask the question, so how much did that save? And I don't get I get an answer, but did it save anything? Well, what, so all these applications were free? Costing applications, particularly ones that have been developed a while ago, and maybe they don't now have a direct money chain, how do you cost that? We're doing some interesting work to figure out how you do that. One of the things you do is you go in and find out how many people are operating your data center, and that's an interesting question. We've got to do a little bit better tracking our labor, and I don't mean just tracking what it costs me to pay labor, but what's the labor doing? You don't want that too onerous, but that's also something you've got to know about the application. And then you've got to also figure out what's the network complexity bill for running all those applications. I mean, I will tell you one of the things that makes NMCI and will make NGen challenging. People often ask me, well, why can't you just throw this application on? And how come it takes you longer to get your applications on than I can, what I get a lot of people do is they'll say, well, at home, I can put this application on my network just like that. I have to explain to them, well, you probably don't have 800,000 users on your at-home network, and you're probably not trying to make that run in an environment that has 6,800 other applications running. How do you keep that running? How do you keep them all smoothing without interacting? That's hard to do. And you've got to know that network complexity when you go to remove it too. So one of the other factors you got to look at, you may have the app that looks perfect, but then you find out that app is not going to be the one that I can sustain over an enterprise network. So the other thing I want to, you triggered one other thought I did want to leave. I think Steve is partially right in his use of the word consumerization. But I think inside DoD, I'm not so much interested in consumerization as I am interested in transparency of data. I'm an enterprise business. We are, on any given day, the Department of Navy, if we were Fortune 500, we would be Fortune 3 or 4. Depends on what acquisition is happening that day. I'm going to be all about enterprise and business sets of answers, not driven much by what's going on in the consumer world, unless it ties to business. But what I am interested in, what Steve didn't know, we have to get more transparent across this. And my comments today, I keep reminding you, are strictly about the unclassified business world. I want to set aside the classified world. It's a different world. It has some different requirements. But from sheer volume of data, applications, number of seats, the big money is sets inside the NIPRNet world, the unclass world. We have got to get more transparent with everybody, industry, the public, internal to ourselves. My personal opinion on that, that's a goodness for us because a couple things happen. We have to get better at security across the NIPRNet and the unclassed world. The we being all of us. The entire nation has to get better at that. We will do that in a cost-effective way the more we will share and be open about that data and the more we can partner, and I mean truly partner with the commercial sector. We have to get better at that. We, DoD, we, the government, have to get better at that. You and industry have to get better at that. So my last gripe, that was a great question, so you spurred all this. One of the things that I will tell you that I see, industries today seem to know a whole lot less about my particular business line and the money I spend than they used to. I see you bring in, I take a lot of meetings and I'll have the company come in and they'll start telling me and I'll ask them basic questions that you would know about your commercial business if you were going into it, and I don't get good answers. So while I'm got to get better, and some of my staff is out here, you can ask them, I beat them up every day about what we know about the private sector. I have a whole set of little group of people that do nothing but look at the private sector, where stocks are going, who's making what investments, what's going to happen next in technology, where can I take. Remember, Fortune 3 or 5, depending on the day. I don't think industry, to most of it, understands that that's a Fortune 3 or 5. If you were coming in to see a commercial Fortune 3 or 5, you'd know more about that business. So my challenge to you is, while I'm going to make myself more transparent, you've got to do your homework. There's a lot of money at stake for all of us. There's a lot of other things besides money at stake for the nation if we don't get this right. So please do your homework. Know my business. If there's questions you need to do that, get them on the table. We'll try to answer them to the best we can. It's not always going to be perfect, but we'll be more transparent, but you've got to do your homework. Next question.
Hey, Terry.
How are you today?
Good. Henry Sienkiewicz. So, Terry, I sat at the last Navy's bidders conference for data center consolidations, and could you actually discuss a little bit about how you're thinking about doing this, the Navy's migration to these enterprise services, including the data centers, as well as the security architecture, and I think more importantly for the vendors in the room, what are you looking at for them to be able to provide back to you for information?
Well, I think you ask a good question, and it's a big question. So let me focus on it in parts. When you ask me how am I planning to do my data center migration and how am I going to talk to the vendors, to get to commercial, I want to leverage the competition. So obviously I'm going to do this through the acquisition platform. We're going to go out. You'll see some acquisitions come out from the Department of Navy that are tiered in what we're trying to do. One of the things that we have to get a little better transparent on, and Steve alluded to that this morning, is what are the security requirements that the private sector has to meet. I think FedRAMP does a good job of setting a baseline. Fact of life, in some cases in DoD, even with my unclassed data, I got to go a little bit above that baseline. I don't think we have done quite a good enough job in defining what that is to the private sector. We have to do that. So we've got to get a better job of explaining what is the baseline, and it's not a single baseline and a single above. It's for each of those tiered complexity levels. So if I'm having to spend money to go to a private cloud with someone, it's just a Department of Navy cloud and a commercial one, I'm doing that because of that data needs more protection. So how do I differentiate for the private sector what I mean by more protection? That may mean I need more sensors. May mean I actually have to put, in some cases, government sensors on my piece of your data center that contains my data. How do we work that out? And I am perfectly aware, given all the things that have happened lately, that creates some tension when I say I want my sensor on my data in your data center. I will tell you, though, at some points, you'll have to make a choice. And the choice will be, do you want my money or not? Because that's going to be my requirement in some cases. Now, I want to limit that, and I don't want to limit it because I care about your money. I don't. I care about my money. And if I limit that, then you give me a better price. How do I do that smartly is part of what we are wrestling with. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that is a perfectly smooth operation. You'd all laugh at me, and you should. We are in the early pieces of all this. How do we determine what is the right level of security? What's the right level of exposure and transparency that we can both live with to drive the price down, but also to meet mission and protect what I can't expose yet? There's a lot of work to be done in that. How do we get what's appropriate for cloud? I mean, we took some early steps in cloud. I told you about, we went to completely a public cloud for our public-facing data. That's a pretty easy one to make the decision on. What makes sense for cloud in the rest of my environment? As I've said, there are some places today, given what my applications do, and I've come to appreciate this statement more in the last 3 years. Just because things are older doesn't mean their value is less. And I try to remind my wife of that just because things are older, the value is not less. Some things can be old and work perfectly okay. I mean, we had this big debate. How many here have any programs or any apps that are still running in COBOL? Okay, you know what? If you raised your hand, I do. I can sit at the meeting. I'm a COBOL user. For some mainframe stuff, when I look at the overall cost, that's still okay. That still makes sense for me to use that, given the investment today it would take me to move that. You gotta know that. You have to go through, look at the investment it would take to clean it up. Is it meeting the mission? And can I use technology around that to drop the cost? The answer is yes to all of that. In other cases, not so much. I got to get rid of that. So I have to do, I think, part of the data I got to provide. Where do I want to say, listen, I got to get rid of this. This language is old. How do I get that in a way? One of the dialogues we've had lately, a lot of technology out there that says they can come in and we can modernize your app. That's an interesting term, modernize the app. What does that mean? The fact that you can modernize it and wrap it in a shell that will now run on Win 7 is somewhat helpful, but that doesn't necessarily mean it modernized the app. It still needs all of the other structure around it to run that app. I can't move it yet because it still needs to be close to user. So when do we make that decision? We've got to be transparent. But I also need, and this is tough, and I'm going to say this in the wrong way. I need industry to be more accurate. I'll use the word accurate. When they say modernization, just like I got to give you more data, you got to come back to me and say, well, when I say modernize, what I really mean is it could run in this operating system, but nothing else has changed. That has some value, and in some cases I want to do that. What I get a lot of times is, well, it modernizes, it will take that app and you won't even know that it was ever an old app. Well, in many cases, that's what we would call not a true statement. So how do we have that? And again, please don't take me wrong. This is change on both sides. I freely understand and admit we've got to get more transparent with industry. But if that's going to happen, you've got to be more transparent with us. So that was a long answer. I don't even know if it answered the question. I hope so.
We have one more question over here.
Well, first of all, I'm really glad you said Cobalt, not Fortran. The question I'd really like to ask you, and won't, is your thoughts on what's happening over in the Capitol building today as they discuss the cyber bill. And not necessarily the pros and cons necessarily, but as it might relate to your ability to do your job. I'm not going to ask that one. I know this is I don't believe this is non-attribution, but so I'm going to shift my topic to standardization, Terry. And you and I haven't had a chance to talk about this, but I've been I'm thinking the pendulum may have swung a little bit too far. I'm an old Navy warrior, as you know, and when I think about some of my greatest assets, it wasn't necessarily standardization as it applied to the propulsion plant when it came to war plans. In fact, dispersal of assets, diversity of solutions and capabilities were essentially perhaps the greatest defense that I might have had in a combat situation. Will you talk a little? Everybody understands the benefits of standardization, but will you talk a little bit about some of your concerns that it may have relative to your ability to protect the data that you just talked about?
Yeah, first of all, I'm going to say I don't think the pendulum has shifted too far at all. I think the talk about the pendulum has shifted too far, but we haven't executed to some of that. So do I think that we've got to factor in thoughts about, you call it in my reading of a history nut, the Pearl Harbor effect. You bounce everything in one spot. I think so, but you know what? I'm at 150 data centers. My goal is to get down to 25 or less. I think that's enough dispersal. I still think the focus is get down to the 25 or less. And when I say 25 or less, what I really mean is I want to get out of today's kind of fixed structure environment. That doesn't mean I won't have some form of server location, pod in some place that makes sense, and I might do that for backup. But the other thing I can do with backup, one of my locations is just called vendor. I don't necessarily know, and frankly, as long as it can get to the data for backup, I don't actually care where it's at. And I might not know exactly where that data is located in a vendor environment. That's okay, and frankly, nobody else may know where that vendor except that particular vendor. So that gives me some security of dispersal. What I'm more interested in right now is making sure that I meet the security layer that I need for the data. And I would tell you this, there's another term that people don't like that I talk about. There's data that is more business and operational support than it is direct combat support. I have to take some risk. We're in the risk business. I have been both in and out of uniform. Hardest decisions you make as a military commander is what's the risk level that I'm going to move people in? Well, you know what? If I can make that decision, I think I ought to be able to make the decision about what's the risk level I can move data in. We got to get better at that. And we have to understand those risks. So I don't want to minimize it, but it is the decision we have to go after. Data goes into dangerous places too. You know, we have these philosophical discussions about the internet. Internet is a dangerous place, okay? There are certain parts of Chicago that are dangerous places. I still go there. We send people every day to dangerous spots. Okay, you just got to make sure you get the risk decisions right. When is the risk and gain for doing that? Not an easy decision to get to, but it's a pretty easy question to understand. That's what you got to ask. So I think that's more important than the physical location. What is the risk around the data? And that also, what are the dependencies on that risk? I mean, one of the things that we've got to recognize, data is perishable. Some of you have heard me tell the story, but I really think it illustrates it before. In a previous life, I was part of an experiment that we were going to encrypt squad radios. So where's Scott? Scott's former Marine. So say Scott and I are in the squad, and I would yell out to Scott, duck, because we could see the enemy. Well, we did this experiment. We put the encrypted data in, and by the time I yelled duck and it got through the encryption, I didn't need to yell duck. I had to yell something else for Scott. It wasn't any more about Scott. It was about picking up Scott and moving him to a location where we could get him out and what was left of Scott out. That's not a good place to be. You got to understand the timelines of the data. When is it valuable? When is it? And it is not at the same value for the length of time. That's probably the key decision to get. Some data has tactical value, operational, strategic, and it will change the value of the data. You know, I get a lot of questions about, well, you have parts and logistics data in commercial locations. Sure I do. I mean, I buy my parts just like everybody else from the commercial world. Well, why don't you all just put that on the SIPRNet? There's a really simple reason we don't put that on the SIPRNet. Dollars. None of you who are taxpayers would want to pay that bill. How do I protect it enough, still be able to operate at a fiscally certified? That's the question I spend a lot of time with. The second part of that is when I put it in the commercial world, and I do worry somewhat about this. How do I ensure, this gets to the question about do I need to put that you're doing what you said you were going to do with the data. And not because I don't think that the commercial world's out there trying to take shortcuts and lie about what to do it. It's just the same problems I have. Did everybody do what they were supposed to do to make sure it's out there? Because in the end game, while I can say I'm going to put things into commercial, and I can make the commercial side responsible for the business side of that, it's my data. And as much as I might want to say I don't own it, I own the security and protection of that data. The government, Department of the Navy, we own that. We will always own that. It's one of the reasons we have to be a little more careful. The one thing I cannot outsource, and you do not want me to, is the responsibility for protecting and ensuring that my data meets those protection standards. So that's another long answer, but that's what I really am focused on right now. How do I do that, and how do I ensure that's happening? I think that's the bigger security problem.